For this Halloween special, I thought I would take a look into the second game in the vampire-themed action game, BloodRayne 2, the sequel to the original BloodRayne from 2002. The game is reviewed for the Microsoft Xbox and PC via Steam. It is also available for the PlayStation 2. The story of the game follows anti-heroine Rayne, a dhampir or half-vampire woman on the hunt for her pure vampire father, Kagan, seeking to kill him for revenge on forcing himself on her mother and later killing the rest of her family. Sometimes after the events of the first game, which was set somewhere close to World War II, Rayne finally finds him, only for an ally of hers to be captured and sacrificing himself to let Rayne escape and assumedly kill Kagan. Time skip to a more modern era, Rayne is still on the hunt for a vampire quote-unquote family. This time with a human ally named Severin, and Rayne must do whatever it takes to find her vampire quote-unquote family, be it infiltrate parties a la James Bond or fight chaos in the streets of unnamed city to find them, even if it's the start of the apocalypse. For a gothic vampire style, the game's story entertains enough going through each level, so no complaints here. Still a horror-themed action game, BloodRayne 2 improves on some things over the first game. One major aspect is the melee combat, where the first one, it was a shoulder button or mouse button to use your blade alongside different directions of either the analog stick or the keys depending on what you played it on. This one now uses face buttons for melee attacks, such as her tonfa-like arm blades, a kick button, her harpoon, and of course, feeding. Which is not only used for standard guzzling up of blood for health, but can be used as a grapple to start some gruesome kills that help fill up Rayne's rage power. Just make sure the enemy doesn't have any melee attacks, and there you gotta be smart. This was a change for the better, as the melee combat now doesn't feel as stiff while sticking to its over-the-top gore-fest nature. Pair that up with some of Rayne's vampire superpowers such as Aura Vision, Ghost Feeding, Speed Up Slow Time, and Blood Rage, and that's where Rayne's attack and defenses temporarily upgrade. And oh boy, you will need this one in later stages. But speaking of the controls, the PC version of the game is unfortunately disappointing. Mainly with the default controls on the mouse and keyboard feeling a bit uncomfortable in the change of combat focus. While it wasn't great for the first game either, the controls were at least passable enough to get me through the game with them. Here in BloodRayne 2, it's not the case, as the combat really needed a joypad, or in modern times, something like an Xbox 360 controller. But given the game's release before the 360 launch, a mod is required for such a feature, and I'll speak of that later in the review. An aspect that did change for the worse, though, were the guns. The first game had a wide variety of weapons that you could use, felt effective enough for the most part, and coupled with your slow-mo powers, felt like something from a classic John Woo movie, only involving an attractive half-vampire and Nazis rather than the Hong Kong triads and police. Here, it's dulled down a little bit due to the fact that they're magical pistols that are powered by blood that can either drain Rayne's health or be reloaded by the enemy's blood. And besides maybe for tactical reasons like blowing up an oil tank besides an enemy, they're just not worth using that much until you can get missile and flame upgrades for later in the game. And when you have the option to go back and explore previous levels, then there's a little fun in shooting a freaking rocket from two pistols loaded with blood, ridiculous as it sounds. But even still, compared to the use of guns in other hack-and-slash action games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, it's still pretty bad in comparison. However, there are levels with options to use minigun station, which can be useful and make you feel like Sly Stallone in Rambo 4, but like with the missiles, it's still not enough to save the mechanic. What also improved were the visuals, as the characters now look a little more detailed than the first, even to the most fan-servicey features. Even the gothic-themed environments from mansions to city alleys and dance clubs just look decent enough to feel a bit immersed. If there was any flaw I had with it though, is that it could sometimes feel a little too dark, but that could be rectified pretty quickly with the Aura Vision mechanic. In where not only Rayne's vision brightens up, it also points to the next objective should you feel lost. Looks simple, but it's effective. Some of the voice acting is also a bit of an improvement as well, but it's slightly mixed. Laura Bailey's performance as Rayne is far better compared to the first game. The voice of Rayne's vampire father Kagan sounds perfectly intimidating. However, for Rayne's partner Severin, Well, his voice is perfect for some of the remarks he makes, but for the most part, he sounds bored for every other line. Otherwise, the game's soundtrack is a decent selection of mostly goth rock, which suits the game's mood, and the sound effects are good enough for an over-the-top action game with tons of gore. The largest complaint I have with the game overall, well, the replay value is quite low. Everything that is unlockable is so easily obtained by just beating the game, and it's mainly the additional costumes. So if you're interested, you can revisit the levels with Rayne and other costumes, some that are even more scantily clad than what Rayne wore by default, while others are simple recolors of her dress. But interestingly, two outfits that are even more conservative than her normal attire, such as Dark Rayne and hilariously, a full suit of armor, which looks more out of place than the scantily clad ones, especially when Rayne is doing her acrobatics and drinking blood, but I digress. Even with these cool costumes and replaying missions, you may not want to play the game again unless you're really bloodthirsty for some gruesome action. And if you're like me, a fan of the early two BloodRayne games. But overall, BloodRayne 2 is still a fun vampires-themed hack-em-up with better melee combat, but with otherwise weak replay value. If you ever play the PC version like I did before I got my Xbox Classic version, you may want to consider some mods to make it more playable. Like one where you can replay the game with an Xbox 360 controller, which helps improve the playability and is already set up similar to the Xbox Classic version. Just gotta get used to having pad numbers on the screen, but to be fair, playing the Xbox version on an Xbox One also has you getting used to the fact that the black and white buttons are now on the shoulder buttons. On the Xbox Classic, Rayne's second outing scores a 7.5 out of 10. On PC in its vanilla form, it gets a 6 out of 10.